seem peaceful. I'm not quite as well, I thought.
Hello everybody, Adam Steele here. Usually you'll see me as the Reaper guy, but this is the final part in a series that I've been doing on the channel, the Ultimate series. We first did the Ultimate Drums, Ultimate Bass, Ultimate Guitar, and now we're doing Ultimate Vocals. And so this is a little bit different from the Ultimate Guitar, say, where we were refining our process in a certain way. This we're going to have to approach slightly differently. Generally speaking, in front of a singer, you're probably only going to have one microphone. So we've got a relatively simple idea in place, but we're going to explore some of what really makes the ultimate vocal performance in terms of the gear, in terms of the setup, and in terms of the singer, because it all goes together. Now, we are going to talk about these lovely microphones and a couple of others, and I'm going to compare them later on in the video, because different microphones produce different results which can work better in different circumstances, but that's only a part of the equation when it comes to the ultimate vocal. One part that really is important to me is the singer themselves. Are they in the right frame of mind? Have they had enough sleep? Are they properly hydrated? This might sound really silly, but it's something that you might not give enough thought to. Like, I've got a nice big bottle of water here. If I'm doing a vocal session, I might be singing for 2 or 3 hours. I'm going to drink 2 or 3 of these. And honestly, I am going to be going to the bathroom a lot, but that's okay. It takes about 30 minutes once you drink water for that to get into your system and then help to replenish your vocal cords. So if you get to a point in a vocal session where suddenly your throat's feeling really dry, it's kind of too late. And then you're going to have to drink lots of water and then wait for a while for that to get through. Otherwise, you're just fighting an uphill battle and you're going to get worse and worse vocal performances, and if your throat's dry, you might end up causing damage that then really ends the session early. Try not to drink too much coffee. Caffeine can dry your throat out. Definitely don't drink those kind of flavoured water soda things. If they're full of sugar, that's not great, but the sweetness also will kind of strip the throat a bit, especially when you're doing an extended vocal recording session. The way that I see singing, especially studio singing, is it's the difference between going for a gentle walk and running a marathon. Both of them use your legs to make you go forwards, but once you start on the journey of something much bigger, your body reacts, notices, puts you into this kind of sports mode, and then you really have to keep yourself in good condition for the rest of that session to go well. The next thing that not everybody thinks about, especially with the ultimate vocal, is where you are singing. This might sound really obvious to some of you, but it's worth thinking about because there's a reason why vocal booths in studios are made the way they are. If a room is too reflective, too reverberant, that's going to leak onto the recording because a microphone doesn't actually pick up your vocal, it picks up everything, no matter what's there. If there's background noise, that's going in. If there's reflections from the walls, they're going in. You might be really shocked when you record a vocal if you've had the microphone too close to a wall, for example, that you play it back and it might sound kind of hollow, kind of bright, brittle, and you think, oh, I've got a faulty microphone or I've got a broken preamp. More often than not, what's happened is the sound from your voice is going into a microphone, but also bouncing off that wall with a really bright reflection coming back into the microphone. So you've got 2 copies of your vocal going in and slightly cancelling each other out and causing some really weird phase effects. That's where you get things like those reflection filters. They can come in really handy if you're recording in quite a small space. They don't take away the overall reverb of the room very well, but what they do is they take away that first reflection. What they can do is make a microphone sound far more direct, far more present, thicker almost, because there's no kind of clash between that first vocal and that first or even second reflection off the walls. But Adam, you might say, a lot of the bigger recording acts that I've seen, they might be recording in the middle of a big, quite live vocal, kind of in a big studio, and I'm not seeing a reflection filter in sight. So what are you talking about? When you get into larger rooms, the same rules do apply. Don't get too close to a wall, but in a larger room, you can be quite far away from any reflective surfaces, which means that that effect isn't going to be an issue. But you might also have a different issue where then the actual reverb tail of the room can become an issue or not, and that mostly for me depends on genre at that point. We'll talk more about things like compression in a few minutes, but if you do end up with quite a heavily compressed vocal, a lot of what the rest of the microphone recorded is going to come out and really kind of be lifted up. So if you've got quite a reverberant room and you're compressing that really hard, suddenly that vocal's going to sound like you're in that room, and that can become a problem or not, depending on what it is that you're doing. As a result, I'm going to test some of these microphones maybe in here, but the actual testing will be done in my vocal booth, which is properly treated with multiple layers of reflection dampening surfaces. So it's really quite dry in there, which means that I can really get singer to belt out a big note, and that doesn't make the walls rattle, which means that I can get a really dry vocal performance and add reverb and delay later, should I choose to. And just as importantly, if the reverb or delay that I add later doesn't sound quite right, I can play with them and take away sounds that aren't quite right EQ-wise on those without affecting the actual vocal performance. Now, it is kind of difficult to get this in a perfect order when I'm talking about all this kind of stuff, because it's all a package and every single part of this chain is going to affect the others. I'm also going to talk about the difference between using hardware, preamps, compressors and that kind of stuff, and doing it in software. But we'll come back to that after I talk about the microphones, because the microphone itself is the only part of this that absolutely, positively has to be analog. So we've got a singer who's in good health and ready to go. We've got a room for them to record in that isn't going to cause any problems. Now we look at the mic. And I've got a few choices here, and something that really has to be kept in mind is some people say that you should have the right microphone that suits a singer. Whilst I do agree with that, I say that you should go one further and use the microphone that suits the singer and the song, because I tend to record myself quite a lot in this studio, and I will change the microphone out depending on whether I'm doing a rock song, pop song, something that's more of a ballad with a much more open, sparse arrangement, to make what I'm doing fit nicely in that genre. Now, I must say straight away that if you only have the budget for one microphone, generally you should get the most versatile microphone that you can in your budget range, and that will work fine for most of what you do. It just means that when you get down the line of running a professional studio, you should have more choices, and those choices really can pay off in terms of making recording life easy and making vocals immediately sit in the right place in a song. Now, with this being the ultimate vocal video, budget isn't going to really be an issue here, although I will talk about some more affordable mics. And I'm going to start by talking about these from Roswell Audio. The guys from Roswell have been on the Produce Like a Pro channel before more than once. Their microphones are incredible for the money that you're going to spend on them. And I'm talking about these first, not only because these are probably the most affordable in this little lineup here, but also because these guys are a really good example of taking the right parts of a microphone and focusing their budget, and so your budget, on that. Something to be really careful of with cheaper microphones, shall we say, budget microphones, is that quite often the capsule that is used might be inexpensive, it might be tuned in a certain way that doesn't work particularly well on a vocal. And what I mean is, it might sound pleasing at first, but generally speaking, the cheaper capsules, which is the bit of the microphone up here that picks up your voice, might be made quite cheaply and then designed in a way so that it brings out some things that at first listen we find quite pleasing, like brightness, presence. Generally speaking, the ear can be fooled where more top end and more treble means more good. Not necessarily the case when it comes to fitting a good vocal performance in a mix. So the guys at Roswell have really gone the extra mile to make sure that the capsules in their microphones are really good quality and give you a fairly even response, which means that that brightness isn't necessarily there in abundance, but you can bring some of what you want out later with an EQ and not the bits you don't want. One of the problems I find a lot with cheaper microphones is that that brightness lends to an overbearing S sound. The sibilants can be really a lot, and no de-essing plugin or hardware in the world is going to remove all of that overbearing S without turning the vocal into a performance where it sounds like you have no teeth. So a good capsule really is a prime factor. Now, this K47 microphone is a relatively transparent design. This is what they call a transformerless microphone. This is designed to be very clear, very clean, very, I think, crisp might be the word, which means this works really well on things like a voiceover and can work really well on something like a female vocal where clarity is needed. Also on the stand, I have the K67X, which is a slightly different voiced microphone from Roswell, but that has a transformer in there, which in terms of the sound means that that does get a bit thicker, a bit more saturated, and when someone like me really belts a big note into it, that can be really quite pleasing because it makes it sound like it's a bigger sound rather than a more shrill kind of sound. So that can work. Transformerless, transformed, K47, K67X. Both great options. Now I am going to put these up back to back at the end because whether you like one of these or not can be entirely dependent on my voice and the rest of the system that we're going to go through. It can be entirely subjective. You might like one more than the other. You might have to look at loads of other demos of different microphones, especially on the Produce Like a Pro channel. There's loads of them. To see which one works best for what you think you want out of a recording. Moving on, there is this microphone I've just been sent by JZ Mics. This is the Vintage 12, very much kind of inspired by the classic AKG C12, I think, based on the name. This is a really kind of upfront, bright sounding microphone with a really nice capsule. It's kind of quite thin. It's not got the big fat valve thing going on, which can make it much more portable, can make it much more easy to work with. And so that's also a really good choice. I find that brighter microphones suit either really modern rock or that poppy kind of thing straight away. If you're after a slightly darker kind of sound, then something like this might be exactly what you need. This is the Austrian Audio OC818. This thing is a fantastic mic for being really versatile. It's kind of like an AKG 414. It's not got an ultra hyped top end. This can be really nice and smooth across the board. And it's got all the switches and dials and features on it that you might need. If you need a low cut, if you've got a rumble going on in your studio, which hopefully you don't. There might also be, if you need a pad, if the vocal's really loud, you can pad that down. There's different pickup patterns as well. If you want this to be a bit bassier or a bit less bassy, you can do all that in the microphone. Very, very useful. Now over here is something completely different. This is the Slate ML1, the modeling microphone. This has been really good for me over the years. I've used it when I'm experimenting with singers where we're not sure what kind of microphone and what kind of setup is going to work really well on them. This is a really kind of neutral sounding microphone, but it comes with a software that then models a microphone of your choice out of a big list, and then you can then go through their modeling software and put in the preamp and all the other stuff, which we're going to get to shortly. and do it all in a completely different way to what I'm going to be doing with a lot of the others of these. But this is also relatively affordable. As I'm filming this, it's Cyber Monday, and these are on sale at $500, which is, it's a lot of money, but not as much as the one I'm about to talk about now. Whoa. If we really are talking ultimate, then the one at the end, this one, might be the answer. That thing is an absolute beast, and that is a Lewitt 1040 microphone. That thing is an absolute beast. It's big, but it's also really flexible. It's a valve microphone, as you can see from that valve glowing away inside of it. That's connected to a huge remote controlled power supply where I can change how the valve responds, whether it's a solid state mic or a tube mic or anywhere in between. All that kind of control is on there, and that can be controlled remotely. And it sounds amazing, and it should do, because it costs $3,500. Those things are no joke. That's like if you were a car enthusiast and you went to buy a Lamborghini. You know it's expensive, but you know what that means, and you know what you're getting. That's exactly the same with the Lewitt, that it really is incredible, but it's also really flexible, which is part of the cost. Whereas something like the Roswell mics, also really, really good, but they don't have any switches, any controls. They do one thing, and they do one thing really well, and that's it. Which means if you really love the sound of something like one of those Roswells, that could be exactly what you need and no more. If you're going for ultimate flexibility, that's where that Lewitt might come into play. Now, the other thing that is analog that a lot of people don't necessarily think too much about is this. This is a pop filter, and you'll see them in front of pretty much every vocal microphone in a studio, because we really don't want the very sensitive capsules in these to pick up a big kind of gust of wind from our over-enthusiastic singing, because it picks that up way more than it picks up your singing. And that can mean that you suddenly out of nowhere get nice level, nice level, nice level, bwah! And that can really, it's something that can really affect the rest of the chain, and that can make it pretty much impossible to remove from the recording without really being noticeable. Even if you remove the low end and that tiny little bit, that can leave behind some things that you notice, and you just don't want to go down that road. So a pop filter is exactly the kind of thing you need. And this is, for me, the ultimate pop filter. This is a pop filter by a company called Pauly Ton, and it comes with different mounting systems. It comes with a gooseneck. A lot of the cheap pop filters, they kind of droop over time. And that can be really annoying in the middle of a session, having to be distracted and broken out of the focus of recording by having this really important thing just going. So the really expensive ones like this Pauly, that's not dropping. And I've had 8-hour sessions where this gooseneck just has not dropped. It also comes with this thing called a spider mount, where I have mounted it directly to the shock mount for the microphone, and that means it's not going to drop in the middle of the recording because it's fixed to the mic stand. These are really expensive though. Why did I spend that much money when a lot of people are going to say, oh, it's essentially a pair of tights strapped over a coat hanger? You can do that, but you end up with artifacts, especially in any kind of recording style where you're going to crank the high end later on. So something like modern country, pop, a lot of modern rock, we really push the high end on vocals. And at that point, weirdness starts to really come out. And you can really end up making those S's and the sibilants way more obvious by using a cheap pop filter. If you're recording in the kind of genre where you don't boost the high end at all, like old psychedelic rock, that kind of thing, it's probably not a problem at all. But if you've got any genre where it's a real big issue with lots of high end, you might need something like this. I also have a metal pop filter around somewhere from SE, and that thing's really good as well. But this is important because it has loads of these machine milled holes down the side, if you can see that. and it's got two very fine layers of mesh. So if I go p for pop, that's going to hit the first one, and any excess air is going to go out the sides and not cause a compression in between these two layers, because compression in those two layers makes the air gap there behave strangely and makes everything sound a little bit comb filtered. And it's really subtle, but we're talking ultimate here, and really subtle, especially when it gets brought out by compression, saturation, high-end boost on things like Pultex. That can become quite noticeable quite quickly. So that is why I spent a lot of money on a really nice pop filter, because I don't want that to become a problem. And I've had problems before where really obvious strident S's have been caused by the filters, and trying to get rid of that is a nightmare. So just not having those obvious bright S's there in the first place goes a long way. So now I've talked about that bit, this microphone has to be plugged in to something. Now, it can be plugged into something as simple as it's like a clean preamp on a nice interface, like this ID44. I like this a lot. But that is the route that you want to go down, I think, if you're going entirely digital with your processing, which I have done quite a lot, and I do like doing that, but I'm starting to lean more and more into using some outboard gear on the way in, which means we're going to have to talk about preamps. Now, if you're recording a really, really, really clean performance, then to me, it's not that important which preamp you're using, as long as you make sure that the level going into them isn't getting anywhere near the maximum of what that preamp can handle. When we start pushing the preamp by putting a lot of gain on there, putting a lot of level into that preamp, that's when the differences between a lot of the modern and vintage, classic preamps really starts to come into play. For me, this is when we get into people saying something like a Neve 1073 preamp is my favorite preamp. Again, if you're really not pushing the gain on that, I don't think it's that different from another one, but when you start pushing it, the transformers inside that preamp start to saturate, start to make everything sound thick in a way that is really hard to describe, where there's a certain zing in the top of the performance. The low end in performance starts to have these harmonics, so it starts to sound a bit more thick in the low end, but without being overly distorted. It can be really quite a nice thing, especially on a rock vocal or a modern pop vocal. When you start really belting into the microphone, it can be quite forgiving rather than incredibly overly transparent. I'm going to use 4 different preamps today to show a subtle difference between them. Another one is this old SA12 from Stam Audio. This is a big chunky heavy thing, but this is a version of the API 312 preamp, which is very gainy, saturates quite quickly. It really has a character to it once you start giving it a lot of level. There's a reason why this has a trim as well as an input gain, because what you can do with a classic preamp, if it's designed right, is you can turn up the gain far beyond the level that is acceptable for your converters and audio interface to start getting a bit of an overload characteristic, a bit of extra saturation, that gain transformer thing that I was talking about, and then you can use that trim afterwards to bring that output level down so that the level is acceptable for whatever recording device that you're using. That's when I think really kind of classic preamps come into play. Another one that I've got that I like to use is a Drama 1960. That's a valve-based preamp, and that thing has a real kind of cleanness to it up until you start to get to a certain saturation point, at which point it really has kind of a distinct character all its own. And finally, I'm going to use the Camden preamp, which is back in the rack, from Cranbourne Audio. That thing is amazing because it's a really, really clean preamp with noise floors just not there, but it's got this switch where you can add mojo So it's either the cream mode or the thump mode. And I like to use it on the thump mode, just absolutely maxed on vocals, because that brings me into the realm of that kind of preamp saturation thing that makes a vocal sit better in a mix, in my opinion, because that gives me that kind of what I call the transformer zing, which is that kind of, if you listen closely to a well-saturated vocal, along with the melody of the vocal, you will hear a certain zzz kind of thing that's quite pleasing in context, and that really works for me. The other thing that I tend to do after the preamp is I like to use a compressor, and namely, I like to use an 1176. They are ubiquitous in studios, they are everywhere. There is kind of the old cliche that you're not a real recording studio unless you've got an 1176. I don't know how true that is, but it's kind of a general kind of feeling I get from a lot of engineers. And there's a reason that you see them everywhere. They're really versatile. They have a certain characteristic. In fact, you've been hearing an 1176 this whole time. I'm using a voiceover mic, a Sennheiser MKH416, that's been going into the Camden preamp into an 1176. And the way that I have that set is kind of a classic setup that you see on vocals, which is it's set at 4:1 compression, and the attack and release are in numbers instead of actual time. So I set the release as fast as it will go, and the attack is per singer, but it's generally around the noon kind of level, depending on how much clarity we need on the diction. And again, I generally have what they call the Dr. Pepper setting, which is that the input tends to be at kind of 30 and the output tends to be at 18. I've had to dial the output back a little because the converters that I'm sending that into don't like such a hot signal, so I've just had to back that off a little bit. Now, if you look at my 1176s, you will have seen that I had the buttons pressed in at 8:1, which is because I've had my 76s modified. Don't worry about that, that is actually the 4:1 setting, but I also have a 2:1 option in there installed. Don't worry about it. Now, one of the reasons that we use 1176s a lot in the studio is they are an incredibly fast compressor, which means with the ultra fast release, it's faster than a single recording sample at 44.1 kilohertz. It's something that you can get very close with a kind of digital emulation, but you'll never quite get exactly that characteristic because it's faster than that kind of processing allows for. They also have transformers on the input and the output that saturate in a completely different way to the preamp saturates. Namely, the input transformer saturates as you give it more input level, which makes it sound thicker, but the output transformer is only affected by the compressed level, which means that it sounds more even. And the two of those together gives a really pleasing upfront present sound that works really well on a vocal. I like to have my preamp gain set in such a way that when I'm singing, if I'm doing a really quiet note, something that is kind of speaking level or slightly lower, then the needle isn't really moving on the 76, which means that when I really go for it, the needle does kind of get pinned to the end. I like that because that means that I have a much better safety mechanism before it gets recorded into Pro Tools or Reaper or whatever it is that you're using, so that there's much less of a chance of having that vocal, if that's a really good performance, get clipped on the way in, because digital clipping, not so good. Now at this point you can use an EQ in the analog domain. I try and avoid that if I can. The old maxim is the best EQ is no EQ. That's not to say do not use EQ. What that's supposed to mean is try and get the sound as close to what you want using things like choice of microphone placement, preamp choice, all that kind of stuff before you start using EQ to then modify that signal. The reason is when you use an EQ, that affects the phase of that performance, which a little bit tends to not really do much in terms of negative impact. But if you really start playing around with EQ, you can start to cause issues where suddenly the vocal doesn't sound as present as it used to. It might sound a little bit hollow. You might find that it gets lost a little bit, and no amount of EQ corrective afterwards will bring that back. So try and be careful. Depending on the performance, depending on the song, what I might do is get a vocal mic that sounds really good on a singer. And then if it's a little bit too kind of full sounding, I might get somewhere around the 500 hertz range and just dip a dB or two of that out of the vocal performance just to make that sound a little bit more kind of modern. Rather than enhancing the top end, I'm taking out a little bit of the stuffiness in that low mid range. That works for me. When I do that, I have these really rare BBC EQs, which are a 9-octave inductor-based EQ. The closest thing you're going to get to that, if you can't find one of these, is probably the mid-range control on a Neve 1073 EQ, that kind of thing. Be careful, go gentle. I've also considered getting myself a de-esser that's an analog outboard de-esser. I haven't actually got one yet because the one that I want is constantly out of stock, but I was looking at the DBX 502 de-esser, which I would use quite sparingly, but can be quite pleasing on the way in, and because it's all in the analog domain, it doesn't introduce any latency, which can be good for singers to hear as a zero latency foldback option. That's the other thing that's probably worth mentioning here, is that anything I do in terms of analog outboard, if a singer is quite sensitive to latency in a recording system, that can all be sent usually with a mixing kind of app on whatever interface you've got, straight back through to that singer with no latency at all, which means that they now have a very immediate, ready compressed, nice thick sound. If it's got an analog de-esser, that's not going to bug them as well, and that can really be quite pleasing to a singer. When we get to talking about things like reverb and delay, if those have a few milliseconds of extra latency on, I tend to find that that doesn't upset a singer because they're expecting something like reverb to have a little bit of a delay on there because that's what creates the size of it. So that's less crucial than having a zero latency outboard option. And the last thing that these are all going to go through is a converter, of course, which takes that outboard signal, makes it digital. And that's going to be in the Audient ASP880, but using their converter inputs so that it's not going through a second preamp. If you've got to run your outboard gear through another preamp, that is really okay. A lot of people are worried about doing that, but as long as that second preamp is a line preamp that's quite clean, that shouldn't negatively affect your recordings at all, in my experience. If you've got a direct connection to a converter, that also works perfectly well.
You seem very well. Things seem peaceful. I'm not quite as well. I thought you should know. You seem very well. Things seem peaceful. I'm not quite as well. I thought you should know. You seem very well. Things seem peaceful. I'm not quite as well. I thought you should know. You seem very well. Things seem peaceful. I'm not quite as well. I thought you should know. You seem very well. Things seem peaceful. I'm not quite as well. I thought you should know. You seem very well. Things seem peaceful. I'm not quite as well. I thought you should know. You seem very well. Things seem peaceful. I'm not quite as well. I thought you should know. You seem very well. Things seem peaceful. I'm not quite as well. I thought you should know. Well, you're still alive, and I'm here to remind you of the mess you left when you went away. It's not fair to deny me of the cross I bear that you gave to me. You ought to know till you die. Well, you're still alive, and I'm here to remind you of the mess you left when you went away. It's not fair to deny me of the cross I bear that you gave to me. You ought to know till you die. Well, you're still alive, and I'm here to remind you of the mess you left when you went away. It's not fair to deny me of the cross I bear that you gave to me. You ought to know. Well, you're still alive, and I'm here to remind you of the mess you left when you went away. It's not fair to deny me of the cross I bear that you gave to me. You ought to know till you die. Well, you're still alive, and I'm here to remind you of the mess you left when you went away. It's not fair to deny me of the cross I bear that you gave to me. You ought to know. Well, you're still alive, and I'm here to remind you of the mess you left when you went away. It's not fair to deny me of the cross I bear that you gave to me. You ought to know. Well, you're still alive, and I'm here to remind you of the mess you left when you went away. It's not fair to deny me of the cross I bear that you gave to me. You ought to know. Well, you're still alive, and I'm here to remind you of the mess you left when you went away. It's not fair to deny me of the cross I bear that you gave to me. You ought to know.
Okay, so having recorded all those, apologies for the slightly kind of shouty vocal. I didn't think it'd be quite as intense as it was, but it turns out I'm not particularly happy with the performances, but it should show the difference between how a quieter vocal affects a preamp or a mic compared to how a much louder, much more intense vocal can affect exactly the same chain, and how different these are, because they really are different. I made a point of gain matching each microphone by playing a 1 kHz test tone through a little speaker into the microphone from the same distance each time. So if the mic appears louder or quieter, that's a characteristic of the mic with a 1K test tone used to make them all the same. So let's begin with the quiet bit on the Roswell K67X, because this is what I did after the analog chain. So it looks like a lot, but I'll break it down. So after the preamp and the 1176 going in, then I've got this virtual channel thing, which sounds a bit like an SSL desk. Doesn't do that much, but I kind of like it. Then I've got an expander so that if there's any bits where I'm kind of moving around or doing that kind of stuff, that all gets kind of dipped down. Then there's the de-esser, like I was saying, with the 502 or the 902 DBX. This is an exact emulation. Whether it's the same as the hardware or not, I don't have them to compare, but I believe they're very similar. Then I was talking about this Neve EQ, and I've got a tiny little bit of a dip. It looks like I've kind of settled in between the 700 Hertz and the 1.6K. So I'll just click that to the 700 Hertz because on a real Neve it's stepped. You can't just go in between. Then the really big thing that I've done is used an optical compressor, namely an LA2A, which is set so it does almost nothing, again, on the quiet vocal. And then when the big one comes in, it really keeps it in check so that there's minimal automation should need doing. So here's a little bit of the cleaner vocal.
Very well. Things seem peaceful. I'm not quite as well.
Now, that's also going to a reverb, which is one of the Verb Suite classics from Slate. And it's also going to a delay through Echo Boy. But they're very low down, so you can kind of hear they're there, and you can hear it more in solo.
Very well. Things seem...
And I tend to track with a little bit of reverb and delay. Even if they don't get used in the end, it usually makes the singer feel quite a lot better. But you can hear that compared to the K47.
Very well. Things seem peaceful.
Which really seems to have come through quite a lot hotter, despite the fact that I level matched them with a 1K test tone, which is interesting. But if we go to the big sections, you'll really hear the difference here, where the 67X sounds quite thick compared to the 47, which sounds quite bright. So the transformer in the 67 is really kind of holding that down. I'm going to put comparisons somewhere else, but this is just talking about them. Now the JZ, the V12, again, if I go to the quiet bit here.
Very well. Things seem peaceful.
Kind of clean and airy. And then if I go to the big bit.
To deny me of the cross I bear.
You can see the waveforms don't look that different from track to track, but the brightness on that mic is really pulling it forward. Now the Austrian Audio, the 818.
To deny me of the cross I bear that you gave to me.
Doesn't have that extended top end, which also, when I play it in the softer section, means it really sits back in the mix. I would have to automate it up quite a bit.
Very well. Things seem peaceful.
And I'm trying my best to sing at the same dynamic level each time, so it's not kind of me singing quieter, it's how the mics pick that up, and it coming across as darker has really affected the way that it comes across. So here's the 1040, the really expensive one.
Very well. Things seem peaceful.
And that's really coming across a lot louder. I did, like I say, level match them, but that's on the saturated mode with mostly the valve, and that really seems to have kind of thickened up the low end and brought a lot of things out. It does look louder. Maybe it is. Maybe the 1K on that particular mic is slightly down, and that's affected that level. It could be me there. So if I was to do this again, I would change them. But if I listen to the loud bit,
It's not fair to deny me.
you can definitely hear some distortion in the top end there, where it's really pushing the microphone's valve into that kind of drive area. And so if we look at the preamps quickly now, so that's where it really makes the most difference in terms of the loud bit. So this is the EC2.
It's not fair.
This is the 1960.
It's not fair.
Slight drive. And then the 312 is distorted to hell.
It's not fair to deny me.
Which isn't surprising to me, actually, because the 312s famously are very hot preamps. And so pushing them into that drive is relatively easy, because if you listen to the soft bit of the 312,
Seem very well.
compared to the EC2.
Seem very well.
The EC2 seems louder, but then when we get to the big section, the EC2 is a little bit driven.
You deny me.
And the 312 is outright distorted.
You deny me.
You can really hear it fizzing and fuzzing away, which can be a really good thing in a rock track, but might be a little too much at that level. I would probably, with this mic, turn the gain down and then bring the trim back up a bit so it does a little bit of that, but not that much. And then, of course, we've got the Slate ML1.
You deny me of the cross I bear that you gave to me.
Which is running through 2 copies of Virtual Mix Rack. The first one is doing the U87 emulation, the Neve and the 76.
You deny me of the cross.
Which, as you can see, is saturating the Neve when that glows. And then that's going through the exact same setup as everything else after that with the gate and the optical.
You deny me of the cross. Seem very well. Things seem peaceful.
So depending on what kind of voice you have and depending on what kind of song it is, there's a load of really good options here, whether you want bright, whether you want thick, whether you want to do it in software, whether you want to do it in hardware. And there's just so much to go at. I think for me, I'm going to be settling on the Lewitt 1040 with the 1960 preamp. And in future, I'm going to try and get a gate expander and the de-esser in hardware. And I've got the Drama 1960 has an optical compressor inbuilt, which I didn't use today, but I can put the 1176 in the insert path. So then I go back out from that to the optical compressor and then might get myself an EQ for that. So I might do it all in hardware, but I don't have to. The joys of software these days. One last thing I'm going to say actually is the warmth on the drama is fantastic. So here's the Cranbourne for the quiet bit a little bit.
Things seem peaceful.
And then here's the 60.
Things seem peaceful.
It's somehow got a thicker low end and a more present top end without anything else having changed. The gain's the same, the mic's the same, it's just the preamp that's changed. And I think the valve circuit in the 1960s giving it that extra thing that makes it sit in the mix. So yeah, lots to think about. Now, back to me. So there we go, a lot to think about. There was a lot we covered there, not just the microphones, but the preamps, the post-processing, the room even, all of it. Apologies for having to listen to my kind of slightly shouty, yowly vocal when I started doing Alanis Morissette. I didn't think it would be quite that intense. But hopefully that showed the difference between an aggressive vocal and a much cleaner vocal on the same setup every time. So yeah. I hope you've gained something from this, and yeah, I still look at big name producers' production methods and take stuff away every time. There's always something to learn, and I really appreciate constant learning. So I hope you got something out of this. Thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you very soon. Goodbye.